Where is it streaming to?
I don't.
Good, Denise, you know it. God knew it. You probably heard it once and you want to remember.
What do you think? Are you happy with how it looks?
I think so.
Okay. So you set it to start streaming?
I told it to stream. Let's see if I can find the stream. Oh, it still says wedding.
Ouch.
There we go.
I see you. So you set it to start streaming?
I told it to stream. Let's see if I can find the stream. So it's streaming under the tagline wedding.
Is it possible to change that?
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Also, I feel like are the lights going to be off completely? Because you're definitely like super dark in the video.
We'll play around with it. So you go to settings. Let's see here.
Is it a YouTube setting maybe? Maybe you have to go on the YouTube.
I think you're right.
Maybe you have to stop streaming before you can change things.
Is it still streaming?
Yeah.
Oh, let's kill it.
Okay, it says it's going. Yay! Can you send them to me on Hangouts? Perfect.
Yep.
Hangouts it to me. The microphone picks up you tapping on the computer.
I don't think there's much we can do about that.
Well, it's just slide to slide, right? Like you're
Yeah.
not gonna be typing a lot.
No.
I'm gonna recess my squishes.
It's okay. I was in the hospital waiting to have him. The doctor came in, that was my doctor. He was talking about names. I said, I don't know when the baby comes out and I see him, I'll know what his name is. He said, well, he said, you need to think about it because he's going to be a doctor someday. And he said, all my kids go by their middle name. So they're M something, last name. I said, well, he can go wherever he wants to be. I was sitting there just going, Dr. M. Perry Aram.
What do you mean?
He's going to continue.
Yeah, he's gonna finish today. I mean, he has to he has to submit his draft of his thesis, but I'm pretty sure.
I thought he did that.
No, he hasn't submitted it. Well, his final draft. You don't submit your final draft till. So what happens is you do your presentation, and they give you edits for your thesis, and then after you do all the edits, you submit the final draft, and that's when it goes on your like official transcript that you're done. But I'm pretty sure that the standard is that when your presentation is over, you can go by doctor. You're asking me when, which I know we've talked about this a lot, and we never came over the final decision. Can you technically go by doctor as soon as your presentation is over, or can you not go by doctor till your final draft has been submitted and it goes on your transcript?
The consensus.
I know everyone calls you doctor right away, but like technically, if you never submit your final draft, you would get that taken away.
The consensus is I can start calling myself a doctor
When your presentation
when my presentation's over,
but
and they pass me.
But if you never submit the final draft of your thesis, would
Then I'll
that
get
not be valid?
Basically, what happened is someone would call me out eventually. Like I'd be at a job interview or something.
Right, and they'd
be
say,
like,
well, we need your official
Can we see your
transcript."
paperwork? And I'd be like,
So you wouldn't get the paperwork.
yeah.
Right, okay.
So the consensus seems to be I'm allowed to start calling myself a doctor.
You're allowed to start calling yourself doctor,
I don't have the paperwork.
but you
in.
don't technically have the paperwork until you submit the final draft,
Yeah.
which is due like
In May.
April. I think it's the end of April. So yeah, the final draft is due at the end of April. But technically, you can call himself doctor in
2.5 hours.
3 hours.
We're out of this room at 3:30. I mean, like. Even,
Yeah, but then.
No.
Oh, you mean even the committee has to be out of the room at 3:30?
Yeah.
You mean so their decision has to be done at 3:30?
Yeah.
We're streaming all of this still, by the way. Do you want the lights this way, or can we mess?
You can play with the lights. I do not care.
Do you want the ones at the very front off?
Yes.
But that's it.
Yep.
You want all the other ones on? Or do you not have a preference?
No preference. I do not care. I do need an extension cord.
Is this better? Is this acceptable to you?
As long as people can still very clearly read my slides, I do not care. What about your dad's parking pass?
Thank you.
Alright, I need my keys. I do not want this damn tripping hazard.
I didn't want there's another paper to be written.
Well, it's already written. He just has to do edits to it. But he can start calling himself doctor after today. Just technically, if he never submits the final draft, they would take it away from him. But he will be a doctor today. But then if he doesn't do everything else, then his title would be stripped from him.
So it never really ends, does it?
It'll end in the end of April is when the final deadline
Yeah,
is.
but he was saying, or you were saying that it's this one part of his thesis, because he's turned in one 2 weeks ago. Then he has to pick, okay.
He turned in his
one
draft.
of the people on the committee said that this part of it should be submitted to something for,
Oh yeah, well, but that's not to do with school. That's just to do with other things. That's just research. But like
Is
his
it-
school is gonna end in May. Like his schooling will end in May. He will not be a student anymore. In May.
So is he gonna?
Really April.
One step at a time, let's get through today.
Yeah, I don't think he wants to think about the edits on his thesis.
Yeah.
He did something better. Very handsome.
Thank you. You want to text my dad the link?
Yeah. Do I have his phone number? I think it would be a 231 number.
Yep. 510.
I texted.
He's getting nervous.
Yeah, he's a little nervous. He'll be fine. It's a lot. Oh, because I'm not gonna have time between now and the party to look better.
Oh, yeah.
So this is the high point of the party. I'm glad you got to see it. Sorry.
No, you're good. Is there a remotely connecting member?
Wait, no, not friends. Well,
Oh, from the
some
committee.
some family members that could make it. I wanted to see. Not a committee.
Not a committee
member,
member.
All the committee members. would be here.
I was good about the family.
All right, yeah, you were. We were betting on all sorts of things. Dude,
What fancy program is that?
It's called OBS Studio.
He's pacing.
Perry uses it to record.
Early.
online lectures. So
Fancy
he has some
meeting.
fancy technology.
okay, I was totally wrong.
Are you
I
gonna sit way in back?
All the parents are doing it. Yeah, I said no.
His dad
I don't care.
has it.
I don't care.
Not all parents.
That's 25%.
But yeah, you're.
I'm moving out.
25%.
I can't see anything for us in the back.
You go hide in the back.
It's up to you. I don't think there are any rules for where you're allowed to sit.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to convince Michael to come sit in the back with me.
But if you don't want to,
That's I definitely want to sit in the
But I
back.
don't blame you if you don't want to.
Cheers.
I can go.
Okay, you won't be too upset.
No.
Okay.
We'll see you afterwards.
Yeah, see you at the party.
Hello, hello.
Did you find the parking useful?
Yeah,
Was it easy to find a spot?
we went to the second floor.
That's fine.
Yeah, I thought we had to, because we could have parked on the first.
No.
Yes, so now you're right, yeah, we're right by the stairwell, actually.
Actually, we might have been able to park on the, okay, so it's confusing
Because it
because
says floor 1 faculty and staff.
you can park in faculty and staff. The only thing limited for you
Oh,
is
okay.
That was the first step.
So your thing would be here.
Yeah.
Should I?
It's up to you, it's literally up to you.
Still
Oh, will I? So what are we saying? What are we?
Well, these things go there. The first thing.
Oh, no, he said she might have you.
They were just, they already fit.
Towards there, sounds like.
Toys
watching.
watching?
Is Tori at work though?
I don't know. Although she might be able to watch it at work.
She said something to you. So.
She said who's he's presenting for.
Are you gonna go get it or not?
Forget what?
You know, these
Yeah,
movies and these
what do you do with
glasses.
that?
Well, you have your sunglasses.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And then where did you do the thing? Where's the rest of it? So we dropped off some ollies at Bill Reed. Literally, the dog jumped up. Luckily, jumped up, grabbed this necklace, and pulled right. Luckily, it broke because really it would have been pulled to the ground. That dog is nuts. Luckily, it's only this big. So.
Hello.
Hello.
You look sharp.
Thank you.
Who was it that came in and said, you know, 150 things not to do it with dissertation?
Mark Share.
No, I love old man. I'm getting the folder and shirt.
This is not planned. This
Yes,
is
it-
You're kidding.
Yep. All this gave me.
Well, that's all good luck then.
I went to bed.
Hurry up in the regular time.
Yeah.
And then I figure out.
And you slept well?
No.
Yeah.
I'll say no worse than usual these last few weeks.
Okay.
We're also trying to watch some.
Yeah, 4 days we were trying to watch some earlier.
Oh, nice.
Is it streaming right now?
Yeah. It's live right now. You probably can pull it up.
Thank you.
If someone is watching,
Should I turn up the gain on the mic?
you do what?
Should I turn up the gain on the
Can
mic?
I get,
I don't know.
can I get Wi-Fi in
And
here?
listen to what it sounds like.
Sure.
Can I get Wi-Fi in here?
Yeah.
Or do you have to sign in under your,
William Mary has.
let's see.
But there is no more official William and Mary. You have to go through ED's room, and that's really annoying to set up on.
Proper.
It's not no longer as easy as just typing.
EDU room is the only one.
Well,
There's a William Mary welcome.
I don't really do William and Mary welcome.
Tap here to sign in.
They're very annoying. It's really annoying.
Why do they do that? Same as TCC.
Like they need to be on someone.
It's the EDU room, just like TCC. They can't, guests can't
You
sign
got
in.
EDU?
No, we have the same thing. It's like,
You would say, because if you have EDU room, then you can use that on here, like it's not. Like ODA uses EDU room and.
no, we don't have
Yeah.
EDU.
And I use.
We learned out of the presentation to.
That's a great code.
Previous.
On every level.
On it
So Ken
today.
Sharman says something comments here. He's like,
How do you guys run Wi-Fi service?
so he's like, take it down, get the other one. They're gonna start kicking her all in.
Yeah.
Is it a different router? Like a whole like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
Yeah, it's supposed to be.
They're gonna be just taking 2 hours.
Like,
Oh,
you're not just
So I don't want it in this room.
scattering and.
Dude, I couldn't get on. I kept trying different ways. I never get
Yeah.
access to.
Do they give you Paris login and stuff?
Sounds like.
No, I just did the, I tried doing the EDs,
Yeah.
whatever.
Does it say
The
yes
women
to
welcome.
login or?
Yeah.
No, yeah.
I think the head to your word and 3 5 feet, so it's time to keep me.
I have a meeting and stuff few weekends, gotcha, but last week was the worst.
Hello, everyone.
Hey.
Everybody doing good?
Oh, yeah.
You're so excited? You can all hardly sit down.
That's right.
AJ's watching the live stream.
That's very nice being this stuff.
Is David watching?
Yeah.
First time that we watched this, we didn't really see what that people. Can't remember
Go away, see if it's,
I don't think I ever went to a defense, it's like the first one. Yeah, I have some memory.
Yes.
Might be less than
No, I definitely didn't go to
I don't know Mark the Fast.
Have you been through defense? Do you remember undergrad?
That's the thing, 'cause like maybe like my first month here, they were told to go to some defense and then locked in. And left.
I went to this grade,
You can't tell Marco, it's just,
but
it's distracting.
it was long ago, but it was such a traumatic event, but it was stuck with me. But really my college was like,
I should save this.
I don't remember it. It was my first year. I didn't know who this person was. What was the
Oh,
name?
okay.
I don't know. People in the kind of thing.
I gotta thank you for John Daly. I mean, everyone did, but I should say that in my APPEs. That's one. Right.
Yeah, it's nice down there. They got nice little trails. And if you don't go on that, you can rent a little farmland there, which is also nice. If you there's a way going down, not in that residential. Yeah, definitely. If you go to a park, you can't go past that. That leads to the dead end. Oh, no, I can't. 10 minutes or something? 9 minutes. Don't worry, only one of the committee, no, 2 of the committee members are here.
I have to get on email and answer my free emails, which is just FYI. Today. I have to get on and answer my free emails.
That's the goal. Yeah. Wow.
Well, it was Peter who sent an email Wednesday, but he knew I was coming Thursday. So,
All right. Now that you're here, we can actually do this.
Say again.
Now that you're here, we can actually do this.
Yeah.
Because you know the minutes and the rules. Very couple
She was living in the same place.
Good. You sleep okay in the place that's like, and the first night of it?
Oh,
I
yeah.
never sleep on the first night of it.
You know.
Did the cat keep bothering you?
I think because I have a cat, I think he smells so green, he just stays away from me. I'm guessing. My cat sleeps on my feet. So I'm like, I don't care, you know, put him in sleep, and I do it all the time. So now I don't want to, I just bring it, I can get up. And she'll lay there, and so I just like, try to curl up.
Oh, no, we're missing stuff.
It is what it is.
Hey, Bill. I still haven't figured it out. I borrowed a piece of
This is the recording. Yep, that computer's streaming right now, and this mic's picking up everyone.
This question. How do I spell the colors? How do I spell after the company? Tony is probably the single richest man in India, and they run the Tata Corporation. So Mumford's, it's a 3-volume series. I've got it in my personal library somewhere. Okay. Like all my books.
Bless you.
The other person who has this
Well, that has to go.
should be
Yeah, it helps. It's hard to tell everybody.
You want to get that and read it, or it's a
I would like to compare these. You made it sound like that was a good thing to
It's a good,
delve
it's a
into.
really good series of lectures.
Yeah.
Known for
I got
most
a
people
had this store, I got just
fields
had just had really had about
It's a field trip.
That's nothing.
I try and think of
I'm nervous. No, I'm always forget. Oh, you're sure I saw
Now, how long did it take us to get through one chapter?
It's fine.
We chapter.
In 5 minutes.
Did we get through the whole thing? I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's about semester or maybe 2
It's
semesters.
Yeah.
So yeah, I first heard of Renew Arnold and I started coming back. And so I got a copy of the book. I read the first paragraph. It took me like a week. Just that intro paragraph. This is mechanics.
It is a very usual situation. There is a very nice book by Partial Differential Equations by Hermann. And I read it when I was in the 3rd year at the university. And in 6 hours I was able to cover 2 pages and write about 10 pages of my own notes.
Oh my gosh.
But actually I learned quite a lot of it.
I definitely subscribe to the philosophy of write as much and as clearly as possible and not as little as possible.
As a matter of fact, it is not the best idea.
It's not.
When too much is written, you stop thinking about that. You are just reading, and you don't read it or not. You miss a lot of things.
Okay.
So it is good that, well, in a week you read 1 paragraph.
And think about it for a month.
Yes.
It's a great find.
All right. Thank you.
Did you match your rod with your shirt on purpose?
No, but purple is a good color, so I always go for
My
it.
favorite. So
Thank you.
you do great.
Appreciate it.
You need to send your best wishes.
Awesome.
Have a card from me every day.
Thank you so much.
Every semester.
Schedules are on the
Also, you would proofs and then
Apparently, you was
but again,
yes.
I haven't been back to Ohio.
you see, several years ago, I got a very famous grant from one of the Russian cars to go to Russia. It will pay a lot of money, but Veronica said no, we are not going.
Oh, I'm boy, sorry, I muted the phone.
Okay, I guess we can begin. For those who don't know me, I'm John Bloss, and I'm the person who's been responsible for torturing Harry for the past several years. And I can't remember all the details, but I remember that he was kind of interested in my work when he was looking around for grad schools. And I'm pretty sure I gave him a seminar remotely when he was up in Michigan, in northern Michigan, under 18 feet of snow. And but the internet did work, so I gave him a seminar on some of the work that I was doing. And then, strangely enough, he decided to come here anyway. So,
But did you do your best?
He did his best to make sure that the material was too abstract for me not to go.
right. So he is going to tell us about his PhD work on dynamical Hamiltonian monodromy.
All right. Well, first I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank the committee for all your feedback, especially over the years and these last few weeks, getting me ready for this. And let's just dive right in. So what I'm going to do is just
set up what I'm going to talk about. This is going to be some very seemingly abstract mathematics, abstract physics, and so I want to use a little bit of this time to just get you in the right mindset of what the heck are we doing with this monodromy stuff? What do we mean? And to get there, I'm going to have to start talking about some phase space mechanics. For all the physicists and mathematicians in the room, this might seem like this is just review topics, but I promise this is very important things. We're going to have to look at these spaces to figure out what the heck we're doing. So we'll talk about differential forms and correspondingly symplectic geometry. And then after we get through that, I can actually start to figure out what the heck I mean by static monodromy and dynamical monodromy. Once I've established that, we'll go into the actual experiments. I know it's weird, theoretical physicists doing experiments, but we wanted to do this. We wanted to be the ones to show this was a real thing. So we built our own apparatus. And at the very end, I wanted to start extending these ideas, start thinking about monodromy, not just in terms of particles or gases, but how could I explore this topic further? And so I postulated an idea of this topological change in an optical system. So let's first get ourselves into the correct mindset. I'm going to go for just a very basic system. I'm going to have a particle bouncing around in a cylindrical box. There are no potentials, no extra forces on this thing. It's just a particle bouncing radially. And now let's give it some angular momentum. All right? Give it some angular momentum, and I'm going to have a classically forbidden region. And it's just due to the angular momentum of this particle just bouncing around. So we've got our idea of the dynamics of a single particle. Why don't we go beyond that? I want to start talking about group dynamics. We're not content to talk about just one particle. So in this video, red particle is going to be the exact same one as the last video, bouncing around, rotating. Black, it's on the same loop. This black particle will have the same energy, the same angular momentum. In fact, anyone on this blue loop is going to have the same energy and angular momentum. And we're just going to let the system evolve. So you see how black and red are doing their radial oscillations and rotating around counterclockwise. Well, so is the blue loop. The blue loop is also rotating around counterclockwise. And this is where we're going to start shifting our mindset to. We're going to stop thinking about individual particles and look at the group behavior, the family. So from there, we need to talk about these family dynamics. And yes, you can think of forces. What I'm going to do is introduce a force in this thing. I'm going to have this loop. Let's get it back to the beginning. Right. The same loop. I sped up the video a little bit, but the initial motion is still the same thing. And then we start applying a force this direction. I'm trying to reduce the angular momentum of these particles. So as I reduce the angular momentum, you're going to start to see that forbidden region start to disappear. Remember, there are no potentials on this. There is no potential well. At this moment, the angular momentum will disappear. Once that angular momentum is zero for that small instant, here, we'll go to the end. Right. The angular momentum disappeared for a moment, then it reappears, and now it's inside this loop. You'll notice the particles, red is going clockwise around. Blue, let's go to the beginning. So red is starting to rotate clockwise, whereas the loop itself is still going counterclockwise. So there's a difference between the family's properties and an individual's properties. Right? So this is what we're trying to get at, this change. I have a loop of particles initially touching forbidden regions. I've got myself the inner forbidden region and outer, just a hard barrier. And I could take this thing across what we call a monodromy circuit. I'll be on the same loop. Every blue particle here versus here has the same energy and angular momentum, and yet the structure is completely different. There is no way for me to take this loop here and stretch it, compress it. There is no way for me to get this loop around the forbidden region without either cutting the loop or crossing the forbidden region. So the way we're going to understand this is it turns out it's going to be a property of multi-value action angle variables. All right? Physicists here, you all should be familiar with this definition of the action variables. I have an action I alpha as 1 over 2 pi integral across a fundamental loop of p dot dqs. And you might briefly remember that they come up in terms as adiabatic invariance. They come up when you're calculating perturbation theory, semi-classical quantizations. This is one of our first steps to building up bigger quantum models about a century ago. And the tag that I want to talk about why we care about the action angle variables is when we're solving mechanical problems, you gotta do simple coordinates, x, y, z, and have complex equations of motion. Or we can go through this hard calculation, calculate your action angle variables. They'll be complex coordinates, but the equations of motion are easy. You can almost read right off of those results. So we're going to have to learn how to correctly evaluate these things. And that's where we're going to segue into setting up a little bit more theory. We're going to first talk about differential forms. So I'll make the physicists happy, mathematicians not so much. I'm going to take this dV term, right? I'll have this called a differential form. And keep in mind with the physicists, right? They'll have some electric field associated with this, a minus E dot dr. And I want to evaluate this term, this quantity dV. Well, if I want to be explicitly mathematical, what I need to do is say, okay, take this form, find an initial point, find a final point, define some path gamma through that space, then parameterize that path, and then after I do all that, I can evaluate this form. Okay, obviously that's a lot of work. We want to find the shortcuts. We want to find the easiest, most efficient ways to evaluate these things. So I'm going to ask, well, can I just find this potential, this V, at the final initial points? When am I allowed to do that? When can I just skip the parameterization and just say, find the beginning and end points to evaluate using a fundamental theorem of calculus? Well, it turns out one of the requirements is that the curl of this E, and since our electric field, for this case here, that curl must be 0. And that creates this condition on the partial derivatives on the differential form. So, this result, this cross derivatives of del Ex with respect to y, or del Ey with respect to x, this is what we call a local test. This guarantees that if our differential form satisfies that partial derivative condition, this form is at least closed. Just means that I can define this space. Now, most of us will not have seen this before, but it turns out I can define an action variable with a differential form. I have not defined the t's or these f's. I will get to that. The emphasis I want to put here now is that this is a closed differential form. If I can evaluate that differential form, then I can get my action variables. But it will turn out, and I'll demonstrate to you, I'll show some examples to convince you, that these t terms here, this tj alpha, some of them are going to be multi-valued functions. Most basic example, the one that comes up for us, an angle. I go around a loop, go again 2 pi, I'm back to the same point in space. So I'm going to have multi-value functions, and if a t is multi-value, the action variable correspondingly must be a multi-value. And this consequence, this is what directly leads to our concepts of Hamiltonian monodromy. So with that in the back of our mind, let's figure out how do I get those, what are those t's, what are those f's, how do I get there? We're going to do this through the concept of symplectic geometry. What I'll say is that all of the mechanics we learn, all that classical mechanics we learn, it's all contained inside this J matrix. You just say 0, identity, minus identity, 0. Inside this J matrix is all the physics we know. We're going to pull canonical transformations out of that. We're going to get our Poisson brackets, our Hamiltonian equations of motion, a new concept I'll introduce, this Hamiltonian vector field. All of it comes from just this J matrix, also known as the symplectic. Right? Now, what is the J product? J product is going to be, I'll have 2 velocity vectors, a u and a v. And I'll break up those vectors into a coordinates and momenta. So my u can be expressed as a part of velocities and coordinates, velocities and momenta. Same thing for v. Now I do this J product. I do a u, j, v, and I'll get this result. I have uq's dotted with vp's. q's, p's, p's, q. There's this mixing of variables, coordinates and momenta. If you remember your Poisson brackets, this should immediately jump out to you. This should immediately make you start thinking of your Poisson brackets. So I have this weird object, this J product. Let's try and pick a picture in our brain what the heck a J product is. So I'm going to try and build up into these abstract dimensional spaces. I'll start at easiest. I'll start with a two-dimensional space, X and Y, and I'll call that my configuration space. Well, I know there are momenta associated with that, so I need to introduce them. So I'll build up. I've got an X coordinate, it correspondingly has an X momentum, and this will be called our XPX point-square plane. Well, there's also a Y coordinate, so there has to be a Y momenta. So I have my YPI point-square plane and my corresponding momentum space. So I've drawn a four-dimensional picture for you. Now let's look at surfaces in this four-dimensional space. And that's why I give you an example. Think of energy shells. When you're calculating Hamiltonians, these things can be functions of coordinates and momenta. So you can picture them as surfaces in this phase space. And here's just a generic example, generic blob I've set up. So here is my surface. And I'll have some reference points. Z, that's a reference to just being Q's and P's together. Right? So I have some X, some Y, Px, Py value, and I'm sitting on this surface in that phase space. Now I'm going to talk about, well, tangent. I'll put a tangent surface. Because I want to talk about how Q's and P's are changing with time. Best way for me to ask, how are they changing in time? Find velocity vectors. I give myself a tangent space and find velocity vectors in that space. These vectors will tell me, how do I change in coordinates? How do I change in momenta? So we built up into this phase space these velocity vectors. Emphasis, the velocity vectors are telling us how the surface changes with respect to changing Q's and P's. The J product, that thing I claim is all of mechanics. What is its geometric meaning? I take just these vectors, ignore the manifold, ignore the surface for now. I take just these velocity vectors and I project them into the Poincare planes. And what happens there? They're sweeping out some area, right? This is the U cross V, the XPX coordinates of that. So I'm getting areas in all these different planes of space. And the J product says is, hey, here's an oriented area, here's an oriented area, add those up. Geometry, that is all the J product does. Add up these projected oriented planes in Poincare space. Definition, fact. I'm not going to go through the proof, I'm just going to say fact. Canonical transformations, you've all heard of these. Canonical transformations conserve these sums. I have geometry and some phase space, and I can change my coordinates, go to a new set of coordinates, and that geometry is conserved. This is going to be very important for us. So, formal definition, what I mean by canonical transformations, right? I can have a two-dimensional phase space I label capital omega. So, capital or lowercase z just means a collection of coordinates and momenta. Q coordinates, P momenta. And I can have a new set of coordinates. I'll call them capital Z's, which are coordinates on the capital Q's, capital P's. My new coordinates can be written as functions of my old coordinates. And I can relate between old and new with a Jacobian. I can say, look, partial derivative of my new z respect to my old z defines this Jacobian. And here's how I'm going to define canonical transformations. I'm not going to use generating functions. I'm not going to talk about here's an action integral. Now that will produce some transformations. No, we're just going to say this matrix product, the transposed Jacobian, J Jacobian, brings back J again. If my new z's and my old z's satisfy this matrix product, that is the canonical transformation. That's the definition I'm using. So with that, we start to pull our mechanics back out of this space. I claim Poisson brackets. You might recall, the Poisson bracket of Fg is going to be the sum of mixed derivatives. Del F, del Q's, del G, del P's, flip it around. G, Q's, F, P's. Now, right, I want to be lazy now. I just built up all this mathematics. I'm not going to do this complex sum. I'm just going to say it's a J product. The Poisson bracket is just a J product of del F's, J, grad, or del Z's. And remember those arguments. We talked about how there is geometry, there's that space, we're conserving the sums. These are velocity vectors in a sense. Continuing on, what about Hamilton's equations of motion? Everyone remembers that a q dot is a del h del p. A p dot is a minus del h del q. Comes directly from the J matrix again. I say, look, my q dot p dot is a J grad h. Here's J. Here is the gradient of the Hamiltonian. Boom. I've got my Hamiltonian equations of motion back. So all I need is this J thing and a function to use for my Hamiltonian, and I'll get equations of motions. I'll also call this a vector field. I'll have a picture of this in the next slide, a Hamiltonian vector field. So I can take any scalar function, right? Some f is z. F is going to be a scalar function, and I'll call that it has an associated Hamiltonian vector field. Definition: that velocity field, that vector field, is going to be J grad f. Here's a picture of this. I'll give you an example. 1/2 p squared minus q squared. It's working in appropriate units if you're upset about that. Right? 1/2 p squared minus q squared. Here is the associated Hamiltonian vector field that thing produces. Now I can ride this vector field. I can give myself some initial points and say, hey, this determines how q's and p's will change with respect to time. How about I integrate that? How about I follow that flow? So we're starting our Z naught and let the flow tell us where to go in space. So we have our Hamiltonian vector field, blue, our flows, that's a result of following the field to a new point in space. Another fact I have to specify, I'm basically generating coordinates and momenta as functions of time. Every single one of those is still a canonical set of coordinates. I started off in a canonical space, I have not left a canonical space. All right, let's keep upgrading. Keep going more and more. I know I keep throwing this at you, right? So in the last picture, you had one vector field. What if I have multiple vector fields? What if I have one field that's always positive p, and I have another vector field that's always positive q? Does it matter which one I follow first? Does the order of letting these flows go matter? I have another one that's just always positive q, another one that's just rotating around. Does the order of operations matter? So it starts initial points. Blue's going F then G, red's going G then F. Red is F then G, blue is G then F. Just switching the order of which Hamiltonian function I followed first. And you can clearly find in just this simple example that I can start at the same point, and for some sets of functions, it does not matter which one I follow first. And for others, it does matter. It does matter. I can end up in completely different spaces in the end, different points. So I'm going to give myself a restriction now. Right? I'm going to start saying that I am going to force myself to only use functions that are Poisson commuting. Typically, their J product of FG, or their velocity vectors, is 0. I need to start talking to my students. All right. So I'm going to force myself. I'm going to ignore any cases like this from ever happening by working with functions, multiple functions, f and g, that are Poisson commuting, right? All right, we're almost getting there. We're almost getting there. Last big concept I got to build up. We're going to talk about level sets, right? So formal definition, consider any of these independent functions, right? F, G, there's 2 independent functions, right? And I'm going to restrict that they're all Poisson commuting functions. And I'll define this thing called a level set, which is a collection of points. Give myself a set of Z points such that the functions themselves are constants. Right? Here's one of the simplest examples I can give you. Here's my function, 1/2 q squared minus p squared. The level sets are the range of p's and q's such that f is a constant number. That's what I mean by a level set. Right? Give myself a set of q's and p's so that the f remains constant. So fact, these lambdas, these level sets, they define n-dimensional surfaces in the 2n-dimensional space. All right. What's the size of this space? It's two-dimensional. I have Q, P. 2 dimensions. My level set, one-dimensional lines, one-dimensional surfaces. Now, try to imagine as we go to more and more spaces, what kind of surfaces you start describing. What we're going to start doing is finding coordinates on these surfaces. That's going to be a crucial next step. I'm going to start building up, finding these level sets, and then building coordinates on those level sets. So let me pull that picture back from before. I give myself a surface and phase space, give myself a reference point, and I want to build coordinates on that level set. So I want to say, how can I describe just the level set? So I'll integrate the flow under one of the functions. In this case, I'll have 2 independent Poisson commuting functions. So I'll integrate the flow, get myself to a point, some z of t1. Right? And these are not necessarily time coordinates, but for all intents and purposes, I will call them time. Sorry, Dennis, I will come back to that later. Now I use the other function, right? I followed one function, I follow the other, and now I'm at some point z of t1, t2. And so if I have my 2 t coordinates, I can describe anywhere on that surface. I do this for the domain of that level set. Right? In that domain level set, I've now built t coordinates on this surface. Now, keep going. You gotta keep going, keep building up. These t coordinates have filled out n-dimensional space. I live in this picture, a 4-dimensional space. I want to get the volume of phase space. I want to get everything. And so what I'm going to do is try and move from one level set to another level set. What I'm effectively saying is change the values of s. Because this level set says, give me a set of f values, constant values, that will define this surface. Well, I can easily imagine going to a different set of f values. And how do I go from this surface to the next one? Well, I'll have these vectors. Typically, the phi one's going to matter for us. The taus are telling us how t's are changing. Phi is telling me how one f value might change. And so I vary s. I start going from one f value to another, to another, to another, and keep my t coordinates across all of them. This is incredibly a non-trivial problem, but I will say we can do this. In fact, trying to do this is what was the origin of monodromy, our understanding of monodromy. Trying to do this construction. So the emphasis, the big takeaway from this. I have taken what was my Q's and P's and made a new set of canonical coordinates, my T's and my F, my time coordinates and my S. Put that in perspective, later on my S, they're going to be energy and angular momentum. Right? Tie it back to physics, try to get back to that physics. I'll talk about changing my energy, changing my angular momentum, and foliating a phase space. So this is a big theorem here. This is what I call the Liouville-Arnold theorem. I'll take those level sets, those lambdas, which is a collection of different f values, f's being the constants of these functions. Fact, if those things are closed, bounded, and connected, then these level sets must be a torus. They must sit on a tori. If you prefer, they say it's the surface of a donut. So I have these n Poisson commuting functions. They have built to this closed, bounded, connected space, and I can have t coordinates that tell me how to move around on this torus. So the torus, go in this picture, this torus has 2 fundamental cycles. You have a cycle going around like this. I have another cycle going around that way, azimuthally. Right? So our fundamental loops are enclosing some amount of area, some amount of volume in there. You can have trivial loops. This one is a loop that you can shrink, deform, and eventually it goes away, encompasses nothing. Whereas the blue and red, I can't pinch them away. I can't close the volume to 0. So, this abstract phase space that we built up, these live on these toruses, and we have t coordinates to ride along in these toruses, right? Let's say I'll start at this reference point. Fact, by Liouville-Arnold theorem, I know the surface must be a torus, and so I'm going to ride around on that. I'll follow some t1, and it's going to do some weird motion like this. Then I can follow t2, and t1 again. I can do some linear combination of t's. I can do some linear combination to start off somewhere and get back to that place. That's the important part. That's the important part. I do some linear combination of these evolutions, and I come back to where I started, because it's a torus. I have to find a way to get back to where I was. And that defines what we call a period lattice. Right? Right, we're looking at t-coordinates, t1, t2 for this torus. And I say, I start off at some z0. I start off here, and I can do some combination and get back to where I was. I can do another one. Right? Just different ways to loop around the cycles of this torus to get back to where I started. So I can define a period lattice. The components of this lattice are our t vectors, our capital T vectors, our period vectors. So finally, definition. What are our action angle variables? They're not just some abstract integrals of p dq's. They are thetas, the angles to go around the torus. Our action is this differential form, this 1 over 2 pi t's. These t's correspond to the period vectors. The period vectors is telling me how I can move around on the torus and get back to where I started. In the f's, those are the level sets. Which torus do I live on? Now, this is not immediately obvious, but it can be shown that this differential form on period vectors and level sets is equal to the one we're more familiar with, an integral on p dq. So, let's start to get to our static and dynamic monotromy. I had to do all of this. I had to go through all of that to convince you that there is some difficulties in that space. And that's what's going to present the interesting phenomena that I want to study. So recall, I can have different level sets. What I'm looking over here is a range of different f values. I'll keep myself to 2. I can have an f1, f2. Once again, take the shortcut for the physicist. Angular momentum, energy. After this, that's all we'll be discussing. I'm going to start shifting away from the abstract math. Any point in this space is one torus. And so I'm going to define what we call a monodromy circuit. What I mean is, give myself some initial points and change my values, go around this space, and come back to where I started. It's going to be a closed circuit. I start off at the same energy and momentum. I end at the same energy and momentum. And after I've done that circuit, what will happen to my period vectors? The lattice itself, right? The red lines are a fictitious representation of how they change as we go around. But once I come back to the same point in space, in f space, my period lattice will have come back to itself. I'm on the same torus. I'm back home. But my period vectors, they do not have to come back. The period vectors can change. The lattice will shift one bit. And that's our definition of, that's how we're starting to get to our monodromy. Our circuit, our monodromy circuit is a change in the F's, energy, angular momentum. Great. And we're going to see this change in the coordinates of my torus. So let's try and move forward for a simple example. Let's actually see this in action. Right? I'm going to go for particle in a box again. I'm going to add a little repulsive force. So I'll have a hard outer wall at the maximum radius, hard outer wall, followed by this inner potential that's pushing away. So my particle starts here and bounces around ad nauseum. My independent Poisson community functions are going to be my Hamiltonian and my angular momentum. And there's a catch. If the angular momentum and the energy are both 0, these guys are no longer independent functions. They're no longer independent functions. So we're good for everywhere but 0, 0. Everywhere else we're fine. All of our theory is completely valid. Let's try and calculate those action angle variables. I need to figure out what my fundamental cycles are. I can think of one being, right? I can think of one being a radial oscillation. I start here and I bounce up, come down. We want to think that's one of our loops. Our other loop, we think azimuth rotation. Start here and just go around. So it turns out it's going to be a bit more than that. We do get one of our period vectors should just be a 2 pi rotation, just one azimuth rotation. Our radial oscillation has some angle swept out. Our radial oscillation is going to be this t rho and this minus delta 1. T rho. It's the time to come back to the same radial position. Look at this picture, right? I have my particle. It starts at the maximum radius starts at the maximum distance away from center, and then I let it flow. I let it evolve, boom. Now it's back to the same radius. So that's T rho, the time to go from here to here. That's what T rho is. Now that delta, these are all these red arcs. The delta is these angles that got swept out during this motion. As this particle moved in time, some angle was swept out. And now we're going to start building up towards what that monodromy is. Where is it coming from? It's in this picture. So let me walk you through this. I'm going to start with negative energy. That means that I'm trapped inside the well. There will always be a classically forbidden region. I'll have some positive momentum, and I'm going to drop that. Right? So I'll go positive momentum and drop down to 0. The delta starts off some large value, approaches 0, becomes negative, more and more negative. We're fine there. Let's pull out of the well. Right? I'll go to positive energy. I've taken that particle, I've raised its energy out of the well. When the angular momentum is 0, there is no forbidden region. I'm outside the potential well. There's no angular momentum to stop me from crossing the origin here. So I'm out of the well, positive momentum. Right? As I bring that angular momentum towards 0, the delta that gets swept out is approaching pi. But if I have just a little bit of negative angular momentum, I go from pi to minus pi. And that is our discontinuity. The next plot I'm going to show you is this picture again. The next plot I'm going to show you is this picture again, but just as a plot of delta versus angular momentum. All right? So I'll sweep out minus angular momentum going to positive angular momentum, and the swept out angle, the delta that got swept out. If I'm energy in the well, I'm totally fine. I'll have some angle swept out, starts at 0, grows big, shrinks around. This is a smooth, continuous function. If I'm going to be integrating with these things, because these things are going to define my differential forms, if I'm going to integrate these things, they better be smooth and continuous. Now I go outside of the well. I go outside the well, as the angular momentum goes to 0, the angle switches to minus pi, flips discontinuity to positive pi. This is a discontinuous function. All right, when we say it's an angle, easy fix. Add 2 pi in. Correct for that. I had a discontinuous function. I can't use it to calculate my action variables. So I'll make the compromise. I'll make it a multi-value function. So here's our static monodromy. Right? I have an action variable. There's this differential form. It'll be a T rho, that period, that time to do one radial oscillation, with respect to dE. Energy is my F value there. Minus this delta 2, this multi-valued function. It's an angle. It literally is an angle with respect to dLs. I can do monodromes here. I can try and evaluate this differential form. I'll get myself coordinates, red and blue. But if I follow that monodromy circuit, do that loop, recall there's that singular point, LE equals 0. Inside that space, at some point, those functions are no longer independent. And so when I change my circuits, I account for the multi-valued nature of delta, my fundamental loops can change. The one example I'll show you is this red loop, if I complete a monodromy circuit, can change into this black loop, where it's this combination of going around and doing a radial motion. So, back. These deltas are multi-valued, the action must be multi-valued. And this picture is what I mean, the red transforming to black, is what I meant way back here when I talk about the period vectors changing. This is what we say is static monodromy. We were trying to understand static monodromy by saying, I have a lot of these different tori, how do I connect my coordinates between toruses? That's static monodromy. But I want to do dynamics. I want to do some work with this stuff. So we're going to get our concept of dynamic monodromy. Go back to that initial picture. I have loop particles, their positions, their orientations, they're assigned to one angle variable. And now I'm going to drive those particles around a monodromy circuit. I'll have some circuit, an angle momentum energy space, and I'm going to introduce external forces. I'll start the particles down here, and I'll torque them around, change their energy, heat torque them, drive them across this circuit to change their angular momentum energy. They'll start off the same torus, they'll end on the same torus. But the structure, there's a topological change by following that monodromy circuit. And this is our dynamical monodromy. There's dynamical manifestations of that abstract space. So, we claim that there's dynamical consequences of this. I want to build an experiment. I want to see this. Turns out our group was the first to even recognize. People were so focused on trying to build TF coordinates and all these different family of tori's. We said, wait a minute, you can do physics with this. Let's do that. So what we were talking about before, right, my simple particle and cylindrical box, this was its potential energy as a function of radius looked like. Just a parabola going down until it hits a hard wall. And there is a inner barrier, outer barrier, just say maximum rho, minimum rho. So I want to build a system that replicates this, has monodromy, has static monodromy in its space. So I'll show you how I created this potential. And it'll be a potential well. It'll have inner and outer, and I'll be able to control the energy and angular momentum of the system. So I can take my particles out of the well and torque them around to recreate that monodromy circuit. Now in order to do this, what we use ended up being a spherical pendulum. Right? I have a nice long spherical pendulum, it's about 2 meters long. And at the end of it, I attached a permanent magnet. And we modeled that magnet as just a dipole moment. So I had a dipole moment aligned with the length of the pendulum. And right underneath the center of that pendulum was this cylindrical coil, this cylindrically symmetric coil. And so as this pendulum is bouncing around, the magnetic forces will see that coil and reflect. So the coil is providing this inner barrier. Gravity is the outer barrier. So I've got a particle, I've got a system with the necessary symmetries with monodromy in it. Here's an actual picture of that setup. Right? Here's the pendulum coming down. This white disc we use for tracking the position of the pendulum is how we got our data. There's that center coil. This starter coil here is just another electromagnetic coil. That one is so that we can always start the pendulum at the same points. Give ourselves consistent initial conditions. Just basically a strong, small coil that captures the magnet, and then we cut the current to 0 and release the magnet. So the starter coil is how we got consistent initial conditions as we drove this thing around. Then I introduced these torque coils. They are in Helmholtz configuration. I'll go into details about them a little bit. But here they are. Here's one coil like this, and you cannot see the rest of the wires, so that connects to this guy as well. And then here's my other pair. These torque coils, that's how I'm going to control the angular momentum of this pendulum as it's radially bouncing around. So I need to control energy and angular momentum to move this particle around, to do a monodromy circuit. Okay. So how do I get the energy? Well, I've got that center coil, and I can easily crank up or crank down the current through that center coil. So here's that potential well, the combination of the mu dot B, the magnetic moment, with the magnetic field from that center coil. Mu dot B gives me this, when I have a nice strong current. It's about 6 amps going through that coil. And then I can turn down the current. If I turn down the current, I'm reducing this energy. In essence, I am raising the energy of the pendulum relative to the barrier. Eventually, if I drop the current low enough, I go from 6 amps to about 0.5 amps, I'll have raised the pendulum out of the potential well. So I control the energy of this thing by controlling the current through that center coil. What about the angular momentum? How do I control the angular momentum? Well, I've got those 2 sets of torque coils, right? They're in Helmholtz configurations, and an Helmholtz configuration produces effectively a uniform magnetic field. Now, I already saw some right-hand rules happening. It's also on twist. How can a uniform magnetic field produce a gradient to torque this pendulum around, right? I'll try and convince you. Here's a magnetic field of both our coils. One coil is producing nominally a uniform BX field. The other coil is creating a nominally uniform BY. I will say for our simulations, we did do the full rectangular coils, right? We did the full calculation, but for illustrative purposes. One coil is uniform X, one coil is uniform Y. There's a magnetic potential, right? Minus mu dot B. So if I calculate the gradient, that potential, the magnetic moment, mu, is aligned with the pendulum. So as the pendulum's orientation changes, That's how I can get a gradient to produce these forces. It turns out that the force with these torque coils is going to be just the magnetic moment, the length of the pendulum, and those fields against those uniform fields. No? I can increase or decrease Vx or Vy by just changing the strength of the current through those coils. And now I've got myself a linear combination. I want a force, and these pictures are all just the forces on the pendulum. I want a force in just the x direction. I turn on just Bx, I turn off just By. I want some combination going backwards. So I play around with the different combination of currents in there to torque this pendulum around. I choose the currents to go through each coil to get the resulting force that I desire to torque it around. So, we've got our apparatus. What's the monodromy circuit we were trying to do? We're going to start with our particles here. This is going to be our ideal monodromy circuit. I start them here with zero angular momentum, negative energy. They're in a potential well. And I'm going to try and drive them around. They're initially just bouncing radially. Each particle is just bouncing radially. And now, apply a torque. Turn on the torques, give them some angular momentum, and let those particles start to go around counterclockwise. Then I can raise the energy. In essence, remember that was decreasing the current of the center coil. So as I raise the energy, the forbidden region will shrink down in size as I have these particles out of that potential well. They're still a forbidden region because they have some positive angular momentum. So this next step is the crucial step. The thing we are interested in is seeing the topological change due to monodromy present in the equations of this system. So this next step is when the critical topological change occurs. Let's go back to the beginning. All right. Pause it for a second. So I'm now applying a force to go from positive angular momentum to zero and then continue on towards negative angular momentum. So at this point, every particle is still going around counterclockwise. Let's go back to the beginning. Everyone's going to be going around counterclockwise, the individual dots. The loop will always go counterclockwise, so dots. Dots are going counterclockwise. There's this inner forbidden region. At angular momentum zero, that forbidden region is gone for a moment. Particles are going to start switching directions. They'll go from rotating counterclockwise to clockwise around. The forbidden region disappears for a moment. I now start putting some negative angular momentum on the particles. The particles are going the other direction around. Let's go to the end. And they've engulfed. The topological change has occurred. Now the rest of the circuit is to just get us back home, get us back to where we started. The loop, like I said, the loop will continue rotating counterclockwise. It will forever do that. But particles themselves are going around clockwise. Keep going. Drop them back into the energy well, right? Drop them back down to negative potential energy. And then apply one last kick to bring the angular momentum back to zero. And I've gotten the topological change. So this is what I call my ideal monodromy circuit. Ideal because I need every single one of these particles. Think about particles. All I have is one pendulum bouncing around. So that means I need every run of this pendulum to follow this circuit and energy, angular momentum, space. So, before I show the results, how do I get that? How do I get this information? What we did was to collect our information, we had a camera. I had a camera. This is an early stuff. We had a camera to track the position of the pendulum. I've got full control of the system. I don't have to worry about complex image analysis. So I did it for a high contrast image. Make everything black and get myself the nice simple white square to follow. Right? So every frame of my camera is telling me where is the position of this pendulum of time. And I can turn that from pixel positions to where the pendulum is throughout the run of motion. Right. This is closer to what our final setup looked like. Our camera was nice high and above the system and tracking this white disk. Right? So every frame would go through some process like this. Every frame would be turned into a binary image, find the white disk, get the center of that disk. That tells me the pixel position. What's the camera is saying is the position of the pendulum. Now to go from pixel to Cartesian space, because I doubt any of you would respect my work if I told you what pixel velocity was. Right. To go from pixel to Cartesian, I did just a one-for-one interpolation. I had about a grid, about 720 points here, where I could fix the pendulum in space. I'd fix the pendulum at that point, take a picture, and say, all right, I know where I'm at in Cartesian space. Hey, camera, tell me what the pixel position is. And so I get myself this nice grid, and I can just do an interpolation, right? Anywhere in between. Find the pixel position of the camera, tell me what the Cartesian position is. And then use the timestamp between frames to calculate the velocity. I did do one additional step to kind of smooth out the motion of these particles. It's what I call, it's a Savitzky-Golay convolution. Right? X. If I say I have the X position of the particle, and I have this noisy data, what I can do is call a polynomial, so it's basically a convolution. And it says, look at your data points. I use a 5-step convolution, so I use the previous two, and the next 2 points, and smooth out the data. You just have this convolution coefficients, normalization constants, and get yourself your smoothed out, your Savitzky-Golay filter data. I actually did a similar thing to get the velocity of the particles. A similar convolution, right? Take my x points. I know the position of the particles, and I know the time between frames. So I say, give myself the positions, do a convolution, account for the time steps, and I'll get the velocity. So that's the prime, the velocity of the particles. So as a comparison, here's a comparison calculating the velocities with just a simple numeric derivative. Here's position frame 1, here's position frame 2, minus divided by time, and I get an incredibly noisy signal. I apply my 60-Golay convolution to get those velocities, and all the noise has been reduced. I've reduced the noise in my signal. And that's how I go from pixel, the camera tracking the pendulum's position, to the location of the pendulum and its velocities. So, now we get to the actual results. There's a lot of information in these videos, so I'm going to go through this carefully. Red was simulation. Red is what we simulated what the particles would do. Each blue dot was an individual pendulum, an individual run of the pendulum as we drove it around a monodromy circuit. The green is a projection of the torus that they live on. Right? The green is the projection of the torus. Specifically, it's this torus, this p theta momentum we're looking at. And so we're going to drive this thing around a monodromy circuit. This XY space is what I've been going over and over again. Particles bouncing around radially and rotating around. So, let's let the data play. Our particles start off radially oscillating, and then we gave them a kick. And we let them start rotating around, changing in time. Now we're getting to the point that we start raising the energy. You're going to start to notice that the inner region is disappearing. The size of the torus is coming down. Now we're ready to approach that critical topological change. I'm going to pause over a bit. We're getting to that critical topological change. The inner barrier is going to disappear. The torus is going to momentarily become what we call a pinched torus. Angular momentum 0. The torus is pinched. Particles keep moving. Keep torquing them in the negative angular momentum direction. And we've gotten the topological change. We've gotten the topological change of rotating these particles around that monodromy circuit to get that loop going from outside the forbidden region to inside the forbidden region. So this is the same thing again. I'm just going to highlight the key frames. Right? Here's the actual monodromy circuit. Same thing. Red was the simulation of the angular momentum and energy, and blue is what each individual particle actually did. So start off at the bottom, zero energy, or zero angular momentum, zero energy. Give them that kick. Our loop is behind our simulation. Right? Get them out of the potential well, get them up high. Get that critical change. That's when the torus becomes a pinch torus, and I've keep driving them, keep giving them some negative angular momentum. And this is where we got in our circuits. Now, if I let the movie play, you're going to notice I said we need to follow an ideal monodromy circuit. The energy, angular momentum, they've started to spread. Our ability to predict where the particles are going to be is starting to get worse and worse. The longer this runs, the more radial oscillations a pendulum does, the worse our uncertainty gets. So eventually the particles will leave our predicted circuit. You'll get some crazy jumbled mess at the end because they're no longer on the same torus. They're all on different torides at this point. If we had completed the circuit, we would get back to this kind of loop. So, let me go back to the good stuff, right? We've got our topological change. We started on one side, we got to that pinch torus, and we saw this topological change. This phenomena was first predicted almost a decade ago, and we were the first ones to ever observe it. Definitely needs some work. There's tons of room for improvement. There's a lot of great information to keep exploring this. There's lots of potential for new research. So, with that, I'm going to my last topic. We're going to talk about optical monodromy. What do I mean? Specifically, I'm talking about the topological change, this idea of that forbidden region disappearing and coming back inside. But I'm going to do this in terms of optics. So here's my goal. Here's this strange concept that I had. I was going to say, let me just take an array of particles, and I'm going to shoot them down a light pipe. And I'll have the rays such that they all form that initial loop that we've always been talking about. They all bounce around that initial loop. And if they do some crazy motion, somehow they've been torqued, whatever the equivalent of torque for a ray is, well, by the end, they'll have this exit trajectory that has that topological change. How do I get that? How do I go from rays coming in to rays going out? Well, let me get you in the mindset. First thing I'm going to do is use Fermat's principle of least time. I'm going to have a ray, right? Ray, start at some initial point, goes to some final point. Anywhere along that point, you can talk about surfaces of constant phase or constant iconal. And I'll say, what's the path that ray travels? Well, it's the path that minimizes the time. So I can rewrite the time in terms of velocity, right? Index of refraction, the speed, the phase speed of the particle there. And so rewriting this instead of time, I can talk about the optical path length. How long is the blue line? And I get this relationship. The optical path length is the index of refraction of the medium, S hat. S hat's the propagation direction, with a dq. Now box this away. We're going to need this one later. I can rewrite this as with an optical Lagrangian and then q, dq, ds. Variations of this must be 0. If you remember your Hamilton's principle. Hamilton's principle says stationary Lagrange, stationary action. The L dt is 0 is Hamilton's principle. So my optical Lagrangian has gotten me Hamilton's principle, but instead of a time dependence, it's a spatial dependence. I've lost time dependence, I switch it out for a coordinate. Right? Continuing on, what we're building up here is an analogy. Right? Here's my ray, blue ray, surfaces of constant iconal, and I say, well, what's the ray doing? Well, it has to obey the wave equation. So I'll use my wave function as an e to the I, k naught, iconal, that phase. And I'm going to do a short wavelength approximation. I'm going to use geometric rays. And with those geometric rays, I can show that the square phase is related to the index of refraction squared. And I'll get to this, what's called the iconal equation. Index, dr, ds. ds is the path, the direction it's traveling, is related to the gradient on these phases. I'll go one step further. I can define a time-like variable tau. Remember, I'm losing the time dependence of these ray paths. All I'm going to keep is their trajectories, where they went. So if I make this substitution, I can rewrite this iconal equation as a d squared r, d, whatever this tau is, this time-like thing, as a gradient of index squared. An acceleration is equal to a gradient. Think back to our Newton's laws. An acceleration is equal to a minus gradient. Our ray optics is perfectly analogous to our particle motions. If I can get the index refraction, if I know the index, I must know the path the ray is going to travel. So for me to get that light pipe that I want to build, I'm going to just use particles. To finish the analogy, let's go back to just our classical particles and use our Maupertuis principle, which just says this reduced action, this P dq, is stationary. P's can be written as a square root 2e minus the potential. This is going to be very important for us, minus the potential. And what you can show yourself is that this reduced action is equivalent to Newton's laws again. I want to focus on this. I now have a path going from some initial point to a final point and create what's called my optomechanical analogy. I start off with Fermat's principle, which says this integral in S dq is stationary, minimizing time. My Maupertuis principle says this integral is minimized, it's reduced action. The P, right, the momenta P dq. These are the same thing. S has been switched out for P, but it's still an integral over Q's. So, my optomechanical analogy, what I'm going to say is I can calculate the path of a classical particle. I calculate the path of a classical particle. I use my classical brain, and I can use my optomechanical analogy through the momenta. Through the momenta, I'll get the potential. Through the potential energy, calculate the index of refraction. I calculate the ray using my classical cap, and then convert that into what the ray path should be. So how do I build my monodromy light pipe? I'm going to go back to my classical 2D cylindrical box problem. Go back to that classical, the one I know very well. My potential is just going to be specular reflections. Okay, the light pipe can't have some sort of internal force driving things around, not yet at least. So I'll have just specular refractions, no potential, and then a hard wall. You can think it was a mirror coating the outer edges of this light pipe. Then I'm going to construct some force that's a function of time that changes the angular momentum of the particles. Obviously, I'll want to write that force as a gradient of potential. I'm going to need a potential. This is potential of x, y, and time. So I want to eliminate that time dependence. I'll make it a straightforward substitution. I'll say the z. Z means the distance down the pipe. Replace z with just some constant times time. So if I find a potential that can change the momentum of these rays, I can rewrite that in terms of x, y, and z potential. So now I have just a coordinate-dependent potential, no time dependence. I'll solve Hamilton's equations, get the ray trajectories, find the paths that I desire, and through my optomechanical analogy, say, hey, replace momenta with a E minus V, this potential on just coordinates, and translate that into my index refraction. My index refraction, that's coordinate dependent. So, now unlike the thing that we started off the way at the beginning, where my particles start off just radial oscillations, I need to guarantee that each ray starts off on that same initial loop. So there is no negative energy. Remember, our potential is just speculative reflections. So I have to do an extra step to guarantee everyone starts on the same angle. What I mean is that everyone has the same energy and angular momentum. It's just an additional step. We define what we call this action Hamiltonian. We're just subtracting out the rotation rate of the loop. Remember, that loop is always rotating around. And so I account for that in some equations of motions and translate that into initial conditions. So this is how I tell you what the initial conditions for the ray is going to be. How do I specify in rays that have the same angular momentum and energy here? So I've got that step. I can tell you what the initial conditions are. Now I need to bring in our force to torque things around. What I start off with is what I call an active force. This is a fictitious force. This force knows the position of the particles and can magically generate the forces necessary to reduce the angular momentum. And so I let it run, right? This red is going to be the angular position of the loop throughout the whole run as the particles are traveling down the pipe. This is what their angular position of the loop always increasing ever so slightly. Then I had this fictitious active force that knew the position of the loop, and so it always knew how to torque these. So it changes the angular momentum of the loop, reducing it. And this would get that topology change. And here's that potential of this active force. F just means the magnitude of the resulting force. Sign of the position of the loop itself. Where is the loop in time? Well, I can't have the pipe magically know the position of the rays. So I'm going to model this motion. Right? Look at the angular velocity. The angular velocity went up and down for a loop of particles. So I slapped on just a nice linear line approximation. I say, treat this as just a nice straight line, or at A times T plus B. Treat that as a nice straight line, and use that to define a new force, a passive one. Here's the angular position of my passive, or my predicted, the dashed line here. So with this passive system, I'll define this new force. one that is going to turn out to rotate in time, rotate as you travel down the pipe, and drive the particles. So now I have basically the same force, but instead of active, it's passive. It's this phi p. It does not know the position of the rays, but it's rotating in a predictive rate of what the loop should be rotating at. So here's my potential. The time dependence, I make that substitution, that constant times time, to get to z coordinates. And here's my setup. All right? What we're going to be looking at. Simple pictures, we're going to look at x, y. The number up here is z, the distance down the pipe in centimeters. So we're looking at distance going down the pipe. Start off my particles on one loop, and every slice is a different index or fraction. Here I'll have high index, low index. Rays, light rays, they bend towards high index. And we'll let this play. Red is just one particle, just help your eyes track it. And the black line is just the history of that particle. So what's happening is that these rays are going down the pipe and bouncing around like so. But the index is rotating as they travel down the length of the pipe. That rotation is eventually reducing the orbital angular momentum. As the orbital angular momentum is reduced, that classically forbidden region will disappear once again and come back. And we've gotten that topological change that we desired, that seemingly monodromy circuit that we're interested in. So a fair question to ask is, wait, you just showed me a picture of this rotating index or fraction constantly twisting around. So here's two ways that you can make this. One is to take a layered pipe, right? Start off with blue being the small index or fraction, yellow being highest. So you construct this material. You get yourself your pipe, low index, higher, higher, higher. And then you play the physics of this thing and you twist that pipe around. Twist it around, rotating the index. That's what my simulation assumes. My simulation assumes you can have these nice twisted pipe. That may not be necessary. What you could instead do is chop it up into little slices of some delta thickness. And have some thickness, and you rotate the thickness. You take all these different slices of this layered material, glue them together. So my simulations assume the nice twisted pipe. We can do the work to say, well, what's the thickness of these individual slices to get that rotation necessary? So this is how I get my rotated index or fraction. So, emphasis. We have designed this variable index or fraction of this light pipe. Every z slice of the pipe has a gradient of high to low. And as you travel down the length of the pipe, it rotates. And here's my monodromy change. Right? Here's the momentum energy. The particle started off with high angular momentum, and then by traveling down the pipe, the orbital angular momentum has been reduced. That's when the critical change occurs, and you've got your loop that has engulfed that forbidden region. The rays, at this point, the rays are starting to bounce around clockwise, but the loop itself is continuing to go counterclockwise. The loop keeps going counterclockwise. The individual rays are rotating in the other direction. Remember that this is the beginning, the difference between the individual versus the family dynamics. So, what we've done today is present a theory on how to correctly build action angle variables. And then we've shown manifestations of static monodromy. It's an inherent property of multi-value action angle variables. And from there, we talked about how this can manifest dynamically. Real particles following these monodromy circuits. And then we built our own experiment to realize that in real life. I've then designed a novel experiment. I proposed this idea of getting this topological change in the orbital angular momentum of these traveling rays. So, what I want to conclude on is that this Hamiltonian monodromy is a developing theory. We keep finding new and new cases of it coming up. We find it in Bose gases, trapped gases. We keep finding it in the quantum swing oscillator. This idea of monodromy and its actions, how it affects the mechanics of these problems, keeps getting found in new places. There is a lot of theory that we still don't fully understand, and there are a ton of potential experiments out there to be done. So this is a very exciting topic. So with that, I'm gonna put some knowledges out there. I gotta thank John DeLoss for tricking me into coming to William & Mary. I gotta thank Seth Aubin. He provided a lot of work. We were not an experimentalist group, and Seth gave us the resources and insight to help us actually build a device. And I gotta thank my collaborator Dan Stanton. I didn't give a shout out to him yet, but the apparatus experiment, the pendulum experiment, that was a 50-50 project with my colleague Dan Stanton. He finished his degree 2 years ago now, about that. So I definitely have to thank Dan Stanton. Funding, of course, in SF and College of William & Mary. And I want to thank all of you for coming here and open up to any questions.
Thank you. Who, you're the outsider. Would you like to be first?
Okay. So you mentioned Liouville-Arnold's theory.
Yes.
But there is 150 years between these two.
Yes.
And what is the difference between what they said?
I don't know the difference.
It was not a joint work for sure.
So I don't know the specific difference. What I do know is that Louisville had set up a bunch of this mathematics, and Arnold connected them all together. He's the one who connected them to the toruses.
Then let me ask you this. There's a very important condition that the joint, what is called, the level set has to be compact.
Yes.
Did Liouville have this condition?
I do not know.
No, he did not. So
Closed and bounded. Louisville had closed and bounded.
Oh.
No, the thing is that actually Liouville's statement was wrong, because it is true only under additional condition of compactness. And I think this was what Arnold has contributed to this. But again, 150 years ago, they did not know what compact is.
Okay. Others? Other questions? Dennis?
Yeah, well, mine should be the last question because I want to concentrate on the last part.
Yep.
Okay. And as you recall, the pieces and parts for this thing were an investment that we made because you guys had a wild hair, John and you and Dan.
Mm-hmm.
And now you got another wild hair, which is still an obstacle for you. Okay, so when you succeed the first time, you completely pipped it by the second one. So you did a fairly quick precis of what it would take to build this thing, but the difference I see is the second version, the twisted pipe, has some embedded, and I'll defer to my mathematician here, some embedded notion of continuity.
Yes.
And the connectedness and maybe even the simple connectedness, et cetera, play a huge role in that differential form. And you computed this continuous version.
So
can I build it in slices? And if I do, what does it look like? What's it going to take to build this?
So I've talked to a couple of people, and the consensus I've gotten is I did a simulation of this nice continuous twisted pipe form. Feedback I've gotten is kind of like I'm skeptical.
Me too.
All right, that's the feedback I've gotten. And so the next step, the natural extension, is to figure out, okay, we're going to have basically these discontinuities. We're going to have to start accounting for the thickness of these individual steps and ask, well, what happens to the rays? Because a fair question to ask is, every time it transitions through one slice to the next, you're going to get this dispersal. You're going to get
We're going to get reflections.
You're going to get reflections.
And that implies a pi phase change in and of itself. And now I'm stacking up n of those if I have.
Oh, yes.
So you didn't analyze that case.
So
How hard is that case to analyze, and is that the next step?
That is the next step to do. So what I did do was just do a simple approximation of treat this as a Gaussian beam and see how much that Gaussian beam disperses traveling down the length of the pipe, and would that ruin the experiments? And
I saw that part, and I'm convinced you can at least say where is the beam.
yeah. So to answer all your questions best I can, I will say where this is at right now is just simple geometric rays, shortwave approximation, nice continuous thing. We need to start introducing those complexities. What about the thickness? What about the actual reflections?
How do I build it? Do I do a dope set of layers and cut a core and then slice it?
That is what I would assume.
Okay, how big is that index variation to get a measurable change?
So my values, I got something of about 0.1 difference across. Yeah.
So I could start with a glass and dope it.
Was that listed in the thesis somewhere? I didn't see your parameters for your pipe. I
think I think it was only explicitly in the picture. I don't think I ever explicitly in the thesis said the range of values.
And how long and how?
By the end, it's about 20 centimeters. So we're talking about a pipe that is, it's not quite, so each mark is like 1 centimeter. So there's about a 2 centimeter square, and about 20 centimeters long.
Okay.
And what we did is, for the Gaussian piece, I assumed, I believe, a red laser. I believe is what I used to do.
You used infrared, but you red laser.
Okay, I used infrared because I was trying to work in best, I wanted the worst case scenario to convince you that a Gaussian beam would still get through this, but I don't. Basically,
But the laser's not going to be expensive.
Laser's not going to be expensive. This is going to be an expensive piece. I have no clue how much that would cost. So.
Can I ask some questions along these lines?
Yes.
So I thought it was pretty interesting that you're using the index of refraction to apply a force, and what you're doing then is you're essentially changing the momentum reflection as you go hit the boundary.
Yes.
But the first question I have is as you point out at the end, if you follow the path of a single beam, it changes its helicity.
Yes.
As you go through this point. Is that the important part, or is the important part that you end up with then your family not changing their direction? I was a little confused on that.
All right, so the important part is, all right, the helicity. So like follow red, and you're gonna notice that it's rotating clockwise now. All right. The important part is that it's the loop itself. The whole loop has still continued its counterclockwise rotation. So it's this combination of to have this kind of motion where an individual is going one direction, the loop's going the other way.
I mean, is it possible for the beam the individual one to change its helicity without having the loop continue to go in the same direction?
The first picture I'd have in my head would create twists. I'd have basically twists in the loop itself. Would be the first picture that comes in my brain.
Which would probably have another name too. But okay, and then the final question I have along the lines of looking at Dennis, I was more fascinated by this. Would you get an equivalent effect if you in fact just bent the curvature a little bit along the boundary? So instead of it being a circle, it was kind of like flattening it.
So instead of
change the
helicity in.
So let use the reflections off of the outer wall. Change the polarization of the.
Not changing the polarization, just changing the way that it reflects, which is what you're doing by changing the index and the ray path as it goes to the boundary. So I would think if you had a hollow pipe that was thing, and you just put a sort of bend in the wall that's twisted, then you'd be able to do this for cheap.
Hollow.
For example, if you flatten portion of the wall.
Not quite flat. I don't have any continuities, but just change the curvature a little bit by hitting it with a hammer.
Okay.
A very delicate hammer.
So a couple of comments. This is no longer monodromy. This is something else. It's similar. I'm trying to get that topological change. So it doesn't meet the definition of monodromy, which is fine. I'm curious in the interesting change in topology. With reflection. So I've got my classical brain on. That's how I know how to do this. So I'm now trying to switch to talking about reflections off the walls and.
Well, you use small wavelengths, so it's still part of it.
Yeah.
I'm in a different place from Bill, and he and I have not conferred on this, but it's likely going to be built in his lab. But maybe a similar cheap option would be to not work in the visible, to work in the X-band microwave or something like it, and then introduce this index change by controlling the location of a circumferential plasma. That might be, and then you could test the monodromy.
Didn't we talk about something like that? No. What we talked about was controlling the index with external fields, and you can only you can only do like 0.0 changes.
I can give you anything you want.
Really?
Yeah. In the microwave, if you operate up to cutoff, you can get huge index changes, and you can tailor that in the profile, and maybe by changing what it is your exciter coil looks like, a helical exciter coil, you can get that to track whatever shape you like too. So you can I'm willing to ponder building it.
So
I want to know it'll work, and you've only computed it for the continuous case.
Yeah. So coming back to Bill's question, can I have just hollow pipe with special reflections? Off the top of my head, I see no immediate reason why that would not work. I don't see any reason why that couldn't work. I'd have to figure out how to redo these calculations, because basically what I'd want to do is try and recreate this loop, but chop out the index and just say find the reflections every time.
Right. And now, what would be key about this, if I'm understanding correctly, correct me otherwise, is that you'd find that if you go down at the right ray angle, that then you get the thing to flip. And if you go at the wrong one, it doesn't flip.
Yes. You would need to aim your ray such that you have one that's going down the pipe and going just the Y direction, another that's aiming around. So.
Right, but the specific angle with the propagation direction is what you use to tune it.
Yes.
And so if you get that wrong, you won't have the effect, but you get it right, and then bingo, you get the effect.
Correct.
So I think you could do that with a bent pipe too.
All right.
I agree. I think if it could be a perfectly circular pipe, but off center in just the right way, so that each bounce, can you bring the next picture? With each bounce you want to reduce the angular momentum, which you can do by a specular reflection. That red particle is going to go straight up, and then we have to have a bounce off the upper part of the wall and have that upper part of the wall tilted a little more this way, so that it will bounce closer to the center.
Well, that was another question I was going to ask along those lines of how this suffers according to any sort of ellipticity as opposed to roundness of the pipe. I guess if it's a twist of ellipticity, then you get the effect.
Yeah.
So you're thinking of like a hollow pipe that has this like arc to it? Is that what you're trying to describe, John?
It has a wobble to it.
Oh, okay. So kind of like a helix.
Reflection to go in the wrong direction, in a different direction.
Yeah.
It's a circular pipe, but the center is a helix. Seth?
Yeah, I guess.
No, I'm fine. That's plenty.
So since we're on the topic of the optical monitoring, I guess I'll ask. So monitoring means you go around around spectrum space once.
Monitoring.
In your spectrum space plot, it was hard to see the going around.
There is no going around. This did not meet the definition of monodromy.
Okay.
It is not. But what is present is loop here. Forbidden region disappears, comes back.
Okay, so you're not claiming monodromy.
I'm not claiming monodromy. I used to claim monodromy until I had a conversation with John a few months ago and went, no, it's not.
Okay.
So that's the confusion. I used to think it was monodromy, and I now understand it is not. I'm still curious because it is a fascinating topical exchange. I'll say inspired by the monodromy studies.
Okay. I guess the next question is, so when you first started talking about this in terms of like the cylindrical box, you didn't have a formal central barrier. The central barrier is just produced by the angular momentum.
Correct.
And the question is, in the experiment you ran, could you have actually gotten rid of the central barrier, the energetic one, and just used the angular momentum?
That brings me back to the first basic things of this picture, where I don't have, because I need some negative energy.
Right. Okay.
So I'm trying to think of, if I eliminate the potential well and all I have is angular momentum, I can get something that is the similar change, loop outside, forbidden inside, forbidden outside. I still don't see a monodromy circuit there because we're never looping around any singular points. One thing I didn't really convey.
What happens if you take your very long cylinder and twist it into a simple torus? Have the thing go right back where it started.
My first thought is that eventually I'll just disperse the beams and I just have this glowing torus pipe. That's my first thought. Sorry.
Because you can't get negative energy.
They're no longer independent functions, and that's what creates the topological change. And I believe Dan's work was talking about things that had like multiple. I don't know. It wasn't multiple singular points. They had. It was a
singular cut.
It was a singular cut. It was like a line. Like instead of just a single point, literally there was.
The system has to be bounded.
Yes.
Is there any extension to sort of unbounded systems, or is it just like that's completely off?
I'd have to look more at that.
Like special cases.
That fractional module. Isn't that close to that? Fractional still bounded. So I've got myself a phase space of tori. It's not tori. It can't be. It's not bounded.
Correct. So.
I don't believe so.
No, it will be simply the flat space.
Yeah.
Yes. It will not be a torus.
Yeah.
It will be a flat space because there are only two types of commutative-free groups, the tori and flat space.
Just.
That's an interesting way of looking at it.
But as a matter of fact, it's about the groups. All the story, the Lewin-Arnold theory, is a simple fact about the groups. I think we discussed it some time ago, but maybe too long ago.
All right. You say another one.
Yeah. The next question is: so you pushed the J matrix hard.
Yes.
And so the question, so that has to do with the world we live in. But what I want to know is, can you imagine a system or different universe where J would not be like that and have like, I don't know.
Yeah,
for sure. At least I don't know.
Yes, it wouldn't look like that. It'd be -2, or it'd have maybe it wouldn't be traceless, or it would have an I in there. I don't know. Just like,
So
can you imagine something where it wouldn't be like that? Situation?
I can imagine situations like that, but what I couldn't imagine is pulling out the equations of the motions we desire from that space. Like, no.
What would we violate? You say everything, we're violating everything. What would we be violating specifically if we didn't have that?
Oh, we wouldn't have an interval system. We wouldn't have considered quantities.
Actually, let me interfere here.
Uh-oh.
The very simple situation. The role of this J matrix is that it defines a skew-symmetric bilinear form. And any skew-symmetric bilinear form, non-degenerate, will be okay.
Okay.
Yes, and by choice of coordinates, you can always make it this one.
I see. Right. Okay. I guess that's kind of it. Oh,
yes.
Yes, yeah, that's good. Right.
So now, what about the preserving the sums, the J primes, or is that just?
It does not. Again, actually, Dennis asked the correct question about the preserving of the volume, but the notion of the volume depends upon the choice of this form. Yes.
So as we change J, the volume
mechanics can be very easily written for any bilinear non-degenerate skew-symmetric form. Yes, and everything will be exactly the same. But again, this does not make any sense, very realistic sense, because such a form can be reduced to the usual one by a choice of coordinates.
Okay. So I guess what I'm asking you is not skew-symmetric.
Yes.
Then there would it be more interesting? Is that, can one imagine a situation where it would not be skew-symmetric?
No, okay. No, everything will fall apart immediately.
Right. Okay. So,
I guess it's the turn of the parents to ask about canonical transformations if they'd like. Or whatever. Or students or anyone else. Any questions?
I don't have any freshmen in the audience who can ask you the difference between exact and...
Yeah.
Right, exact versus closed differential form, whatever. Okay, any others? In that case, thank you again.
All right. Thank you, everyone.